Pixar has long been considered one of the best storytelling studios pretty much in history. But why is that? And has it changed throughout the years? That is what we are going to discuss here on the Story Geek Show on the Orange Grove 55 network. OG, press the damn button.
Let's go.
As always, we have a fantastic panel that is going to discuss this with us. Just over here to my left, or I guess your right if you're watching the screen, Mr. OG55, the Grand Admiral of the channel. How you doing, sir?
I am doing fantastic, Jay. Thank you so much for having me on Story Geeks. I'm really excited to talk some Pixar. Today is the 100th anniversary of the Walt Disney Company, so I think it's a perfect time to kind of do that and kind of discuss this sister studio of Walt Disney Animation. So again, thank you for having me on.
Yeah, of course. George was the one that came up with this idea for this show. And he said, I want to really talk about Pixar storytelling. And if you've been a Story Geeks fan for a long period of time, if you go back into our Story Geeks podcast days, then you know that we've covered Pixar pretty consistently. Because if you're a storytelling channel, you definitely want to be talking about Pixar at some point in time. So it's fun to revisit this topic. And we got a kind of a fun show today addressing Pixar from a very specific framework. OG, if people want to find you, where can they find you besides this channel?
Yeah, you can find me right here on YouTube, Orange Grove 55. You can also find me on Instagram, Orange Grove 55, and you can find me on X, Orange Grove 55.
There it is. Go follow the gentleman. He's always getting into trouble with the with the Universal folks, but it's fun times.
Yeah, it's so funny. It's really funny.
It's funny. It's so funny too because you're always fair. You're always fair, even if you have a difference of opinion. You're always fair. But it cracks me up.
I think you should just save yourself the time, OG, and maybe just post like a Braveheart meme.
Yeah, there you go. That works.
That's perfect. Well, the voice you just heard belongs to Citrus George, the person who came up with the idea for this particular show. George, what made you think about wanting to talk about storytelling and Pixar, and then tell the folks where they can also find you?
Absolutely. Well, for me, I was always a huge fan of Pixar, and I always loved how they kind of separated themselves from the pack, so to speak, when it came time to creativity and storytelling. But then I've also noticed a decline in their way of storytelling and how they want to approach, and it also seems like it affected the audience. And I never really thought I'd see the day where Pixar would kind of drop the ball a little bit. So I'm glad you actually envisioned what I was thinking of how to approach this topic, because I want to go through the transitional period of like Pixar at its heyday to what it is now, and could they possibly bounce back from it and kind of get out of this slump? So I'm so glad that we're able to talk about it, and I'm glad you have me on, joined by these two fellow gentlemen to talk some storytelling and creativity through Pixar. And right now I'm just babbling. So folks, without further ado, if you want to find me, you could do so on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on the podcast, A Walk with Walt. And of course, you'll find me here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner, with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info.
There you go.
Perfect. Well, thank you for introducing the topic to us. I think it's going to be fascinating. I'll kind of give a framework for what that looks like in just a minute. But first, we had to have him back. He was talking to us about Ahsoka, and he was so good that we're like, we got to have him on to talk Pixar too. Evan, welcome back to the show.
Thank you guys for having me. I'm excited. Yeah, I had a blast talking Ahsoka with you guys. I'm a huge Star Wars fan, but I'm also a huge Pixar fan, movie fan, Disney fan. So there's a lot for me to say about this topic. I'm a huge Pixar fan, also a huge box office fan. I have taken note about this discrepancy between the audiences and Pixar movies that are coming out recently. So there's a lot of information and topics and discussion to glean here. But yeah, you guys can find me on Twitter at Harris EV9. I also do a lot of podcasts on other channels. You can look up My Cup of Tea, where we do movie and TV show reviews. We also do Hyperspace Hype on another channel as well, talking everything Star Wars. Nice. So yeah, glad to be back with you guys.
And I'm so glad that, Evan, you're able to join us. But he also had to join because he already signed the Orange Grove registration form. So
I'm on the contract.
There you go.
That's perfect. And I started following Evan, and Evan also you watch a lot of what would you call it, reality TV?
Reality TV. Yeah. Sorry about that.
No. And whenever you post, I'm always like, what is he saying? What is he? Because I'm always interested in what you have to say. And then I'm like, what the hell is he talking about? It's some kind of reality show. But it's awesome.
My friends,
give him a follow.
Yeah, my friends and my family the same way. They're like, Evan, we had to meet you because all you do is talk about Big Brother, Survivor. I'm like, yes, you're right. And Amazing Race. And I also watch all these like anime and Netflix shows that I always want to talk about. Like, I'm loving House of Usher right now. So,
it's so good. Yeah.
Are you watching that too, Jay?
We might need to do another show on the fall of the House of Usher at some point in time. Now, that is not a Disney show in any way, shape, or form.
Does it have anything to do with Usher? Or
it's not.
Different Usher.
You will not find any cool dance moves in this show. It is a different. So for those of you who don't know, Fall of the House of Usher is the latest and the last from Mike Flanagan in his relationship with Netflix. So Mike Flanagan is famous for Haunting of Hill House, one of the best horror limited series probably of all time. Bly Manor. He did Midnight Mass. He did Midnight Club. And I will confess to you right now, I am not able to watch The Haunting of Hill House because it is way too scary. I have anxiety after I tried watching the first episode. And the first episode ends. This is not a spoiler. The first episode ends. I promise we'll get to Pixar. The first episode ends with a character who's standing in a corner, and this guy walks in and sees the character in the corner, and I just went, "I'm out, dude. This is too terrifying. I'm done. I cannot deal with this. My anxiety levels is just way off the charts." But Mike Flanagan is one of my favorite storytellers. He's just the way he tells stories is phenomenal.
It's a great link to this episode because I think Mike Flanagan's a great emotional horror storyteller. Like a lot of his horror derives from like emotional storytelling, and that's definitely the case with Pixar, minus the horror and the dread.
Well, there we go. That covers it. That was a great show, everyone. Have a good night.
And help everybody stay scared. We're gonna happy Halloween. All right, so the structure for today's show is going to be a little bit unique. We're going to talk a little bit about the history of Pixar and how Pixar had a competitive advantage in Hollywood based on what they were able to do. There's some Apple connections that are really fascinating with Pixar that if you don't know about, you should know about because there's always a chance that Apple could buy Disney. It's always a rumor that's out there, right? So if you know some of the connective tissue about why that's being talked about, Pixar is one of the reasons. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to take two Pixar films, one of the highest rated Pixar films and one of the lowest rated Pixar films. We're going to take WALL-E and we're going to take Lightyear. And we're going to run them up against something that was tweeted out by, let me get the name right here. It was tweeted out by Emma Coates, who is a Pixar story artist. And she tweeted out a number of years back. She said, here, Pixar is getting a ton of attention about our storytelling. Here's 22 rules for Pixar storytelling. Anytime we're putting a story together, these 22 rules are what we always use as guidelines to go through. Yeah, we're going to go through every one of these. We'll pull them up. You'll be able to see them on the screen here. It's a little small, so you may have to zoom in a little bit on your screen, but you can see them. We're going to tell you what they are. And we're going to compare these 22 storytelling rules that Pixar uses, and we're going to use that to compare WALL-E to Lightyear and give our feedback as if whether or not those films were working under those 22 rules. Then the last thing we're going to do is we're going to say, so given all that we did just now, we heard the history of Pixar. A lot of the leadership is no longer there, which is one of the key components we're going to talk about. The leadership's no longer there. Here are those 22 storytelling rules. Are the new movies sticking to those rules? And we're going to ask the question, is Pixar still at the top of their game or have they slipped a little bit? That's what we actually want to determine by the end of this podcast. It should be a fascinating conversation. Let's just kick it off with what are some of the things that you guys are aware of the history of Pixar, and what are some of the things that you've picked up along the way that you think contributed to how good of a storytelling entity they are? OG, what do you think? Like, what made Pixar so good?
What made Pixar so good? Well, I think that their ability. I think one thing that Pixar really excels at is to take kind of everyday things and turn them into the extraordinary, right? So you can have a movie about I don't know, bugs, right? And they turned it into this whole thing. You got a movie about cars, these very mundane sort of topics, and they're able to kind of craft these really magnificent, whimsical stories around those topics. Even Monsters Inc. It's just about two guys going to work, basically, right? At the end of the day, right? So I think that's the secret to their success. And obviously the people behind the magic, so to speak. I mean, look, John Lasseter had his issues in his personal life and what have you, not condoning any of that. But as a storyteller, as a creative, he was talented, So I think that he helped craft that studio quite a bit in the early days and was integral to that success. Ed Catmull, another big factor in the Pixar story, And also I think it's just when you have these fledgling studios, they're hungry. You know what I'm saying? They're hungry. It's like you have a big studio like Disney and they're on top. Sometimes those studios get a little lazy. Pixar in its early years, they were really, really hungry, really fighting to do big things. And I think that does matter. And I do think that was definitely part of their success. So yeah, I think it's a lot of factors. I think those pretty much kind of surmise why I believe they've been successful over the years. And, to that point where when you're new and you're a fledgling studio and you're hungrier, you push harder, it kind of also points to maybe the fall, so to speak, decline of Pixar now because they're not that same studio. They're a huge corporation now. They're part of Disney. They become the machine almost, right? It happens. It really does. So I think that's an element to it. But yeah, we'll see.
I was going to ask you, OG, since you mentioned that,
Sure.
Do you think from both studios proclaiming to Pixar and Disney Animation, from them forging as basically as under one banner, so to speak, it kind of gave the security to Pixar to say, okay, well, we could do kind of whatever we want and still kind of get those numbers because we're under the Disney banner. Now, mind you, that acquisition came through right as Cars had premiered in theaters back in 2006. And in the pipeline already, we had Ratatouille and WALL-E and Up, but they were already in the pipeline more so into production before the acquisition came through.
You started to see some cracks in the Pixar formula, I think, with Good Dinosaur. That movie didn't do very well. Brave, I love that movie. I thought it was great, but a lot of people didn't. Cars 2 was another one, and that's all before even Lasseter left. So I think there were cracks in it before he left, and then when he left, and look, also Pixar was dealt kind of a bad hand that they couldn't really control. I think the whole thing with Onward, that movie got screwed over because of the pandemic. Soul, Luca, which I thought was great. A lot of these movies never got a chance even to go to theaters. And there's this kind of perception that they failed, because of that. And it's not really their fault necessarily. So there's elements here outside of Pixar's control, but it's fascinating. There's a lot of things, a lot of moving parts here, I think, with this story.
That's for sure. George, what are some of the things that you picked up on about Pixar's history and what made them so good?
Yeah, kind of going off what OG was saying, when you think of a story and you say, you know what, let's go into the depths of the ocean and let's follow this clownfish on a journey to find his son, where it's a cute adventure, but then when you tie in the realism to that, it's the acceptance of parenthood. It's of the ability to have the emotion that Pixar was able to have, where Marlon as a father, the insecurities of having a child that may not be up to par with everyone else, and he has the insecurities of him going off on his own, and then Marlon ends up learning in time, sometimes you have to let go and let things take its course. You really, when you kind of put them two together and you think, oh yeah, let's tie that into Fish, it's like, you don't really think of that, but Pixar did that. It was a brilliant formula, and it was where they can tie in comedy, but not be overbearing. Sort of kind of like how DreamWorks and Illuminations does, which that's fine for them. It works for them with that formula where they have a lot of that slapstick, consistent throughout the movie. And that's where I feel like Pixar started going that route. It was going too much. They lost the track of having a sense of comedic timing, but also having that emotion and heart to it.
Well, the cool thing about Pixar too is he talked about Finding Nemo, right? and it's about fish. I mean, we shouldn't be relating to fish in any way. But Pixar managed through that storytelling process to a lot of parents maybe would relate to that. Maybe overprotective parents that have a hard time letting go, they can relate to that story, and I think that's also to your point. I mean, to your question, Jay, of the secret to Pixar success, where, it could be a monster, it could be a fish, it could be, a little robot. And they create these circumstances where you relate to these things, anyone, we can all relate to Mike and Sully going to work and clocking in, clocking out. It's so relatable. So relatable.
Yeah. Evan, what do you think? What are some of the things that you see in Pixar storytelling that make it magical?
I think from the jump, what was important for Pixar was to separate itself from the other big animation studios. And I think they did that immediately from their inception. I think what made Pixar so successful was that it made itself so unique from an entity like Disney, which was on a high streak back in the day. Still is, of course. Like Pixar managed to make itself unique from Disney, even though they had very similar, storytelling, emotional storytelling. While where Disney was mostly about those mythological heroes' journeys or heroine journeys with princesses and princesses fairy tales, right? Pixar didn't really concern itself with that too much. They were concerned more about like emotional storytelling, these moral, common human experiences through complex and unique settings, whether you get bugs, fishes, monsters. And what made Pixar so effective early on was that unlike a DreamWorks, like Shrek was very successful, but like unlike a DreamWorks or certain Disney movies, it didn't concern itself with primarily childlike, resonance. What made Pixar so great, and you hear this a lot of time from parents. They're like, "Hey, I went to take my kids to go see Toy Story." And even I was affected by it. Like Pixar has the ability to affect not only children, but parents, young adults, people from numerous ages and cultures now. That's what I think what makes Pixar so great early on. And I think even now, like Pixar, by creating a lot of these more culturally relevant stories, they're able to appeal to a wider audience than ever before. And I think that's working in certain movies, not certain others ones. But it's great for what we're talking about here today with Wall-E and Lightyear, where Wall-E has the ability to talk about very simple topics. It's about relationships and getting close to people, the ability to form good connections. It's a very universal, common thing you see in other movies. What makes Pixar so great was that it affected kids, it affected adults, and it talked about the macro, about how we are handling the world itself. It was handling a number of different themes, while I think certain other Pixar movies are only really narrowing itself down to basic themes. And we'll get to that with Lightyear, where it's like they're not really letting the audience think or experience something new or fresh, which was always what Pixar was about. They come to the theater or streaming, whatever, to see a new and fresh experience. And I don't think a lot of, I think certain Pixar movies these days, especially Onward, which I cannot stand. I hate that movie. I'm not a huge fan of Onward or Lightyear because I think they're very simple. They're not really thinking outside the box. And I think that's what Pixar's, from a lot of the creators, you hear that. They're like, we wanted to take risks, think outside of the box. And certain movies aren't really doing that these days from Pixar.
I agree. I agree with Evan because it's a lot of the current Pixar movies. You can just kind of go in. Some elements could be very entertaining. It could be somewhat engaging, but you kind of lose that connection with those characters of something that you could find relatable without it being seamless. It's like, rather than it just kind of put it in perspective of saying, okay, well, this is this because it's that, or this is that because it's this. It's like how they used to do it. They used to very subtly incorporate it in the storytelling without actually physically saying that. For instance, like Wall-E, there was some environmental aspects to that, but rather than just come out and say it, it was like, okay, let's just incorporate that in the story, and then people can catch on as they watch the movie. And not even just the first time, like the second or third time, a lot of people don't even catch it until, the more times that they watch it. And it's like relating to those characters. You don't know how many times, because speaking of OG that mentioned Monsters Inc., of how many times when Mike Wazowski said this thing, and I get this, how many times I go on a date and it's put that thing back where it came from, or so help me. You don't know how many times I've heard that constantly.
That's good. That's good. Evan, you bring up a great point about Onward. I was not a huge fan of that either, to be honest. And it felt like, to me, the thing I love about Pixar movies, right? The good one, the real good ones, are it feels like it works on so many levels, like for the adults in the room and the children in the room, right? And each group gets something different out of it. Yep. Onward felt like it was a Pixar movie that felt like very much like kind of like a lot of other studios that are just geared towards kids.
Mm-hmm.
Like I was watching.
It felt like a DreamWorks movie. I'm like, am I watching a Pixar movie here?
Yeah, exactly. That's what, like, DreamWorks and Illuminations, it fits well with them. That's their formula.
That's their niche,
But for Pixar, we expected more from them because they set themselves up for a higher level right out of the gate, right with Toy Story. Right. And then it just propelled on. And in my opinion, now, as I said, I enjoyed Soul. I did like Soul. I did enjoy Luca. But even aside from that, where I feel like that Pixar started to decline afterwards was after 2017, right after, actually, it's my favorite Pixar film is Coco. Right? Like after Coco, that's where I feel like it started to decline.
Interesting.
Fair.
Have any of the three of you read Creativity Incorporated by Ed Catmull?
I have not.
Okay, so this is my plug, because I'm going to give a little bit of a recap of that book. It is the best business book I've ever read in my life.
Wow.
It's a phenomenal book. It was so good that I didn't know who Ed Catmull was before I read it. And after I read it, I saw him walking around at Disneyland about 2-3 weeks later after I had just read it. And I gotta go say hi to him because his book is so amazing. And by the time I got over to him, he'd gone back into the back, and I said to one of the cast members, I'm like, is Ed Catmull back there? And she goes, I cannot say who is there or not there. I'm like,
that's a yes.
That's a yes. Yeah. So he's back there. Thanks. Let me just cover a little bit of the history of Pixar, because one of the things I think people get wrong when they think about their favorite stories and their favorite storytellers is I think that there's this misconception that exists that it's just because of the person's personality or their ability to tell stories is just inherent. And that is not generally the case. Generally, that person has come up with a really good process by which they are able to express their creativity. And the people that don't have that process tend to have really hit or miss types of things. But if you have a process that works really well and you get the right people on that bus, you can have hit after hit after hit. And I think Creativity Incorporated gives a really good picture of why Pixar was so successful. So for those of you who don't know, Pixar started out as a hardware company. And by the way, if I get any of the details wrong, I'm sure down in the comments, let me know. But I haven't read the book in a long time. But Pixar started out as a hardware company. They were making a specific type of computer or motherboard, if I'm not mistaken, which is why Apple was interested in them and eventually ended up buying them. But one of the things that Pixar was doing during that time, it was also creating, it was processing data and creating stories, because they felt like if we could just get the story out there, then people would be more attracted to our products. It's about the marketing part of it, right? Mm-hmm. Well, it just so happened that they started putting out really amazing work. And so what they started with the Luxo ball, and you could see the little thing go across the screen, and they went, wow, this is really cool. Maybe we should do a feature film. And so they got into the Toy Story world, started doing a feature film. Here's the key differentiator that most Hollywood studios could not keep up with that Pixar had the ability to do. The way that most things are filmed in Hollywood, you get all of your production set up, you go shoot whatever you need to shoot, you get dailies where they review what was shot that day, they say this is good, this is bad, whatever. You might have to do a reshoot the next day. In that production process, what doesn't happen much, although other people have started adapting to it, like Tom Cruise and Christopher McQuarrie for what they're doing with the Mission Impossible series, it's a little more Pixar-y. But most of the time, your script is locked, You bring in your director submits the film, and they go, this is what the film is. They might do a couple of reshoots if they didn't get quite what they needed, but that's what the film is. It's not like it goes from one step to the next step to the next step to the next step. What Pixar had the ability to do was Pixar said, we can act more like a tech startup than a production studio, in that we can iterate on anything, because everything we're doing is in a computer. If we want a different shot tomorrow, I can come up with a different shot tomorrow. I don't have to have like, oh, no, the script didn't say that, so we can't do that. No, you can iterate on it multiple times. And so what Pixar did was they set up what was called the Storytelling Brain Trust. And the Storytelling Brain Trust consisted of people that they felt like were good storytellers. It was essentially probably led by John Lasseter, because he's more the creative person, and Ed Catmull was more the process guy. And again, it's a history of when Disney finds two people who are awesome: Walt and Roy, Eisner and Wells,
right?
Like Catmull and Lasseter, right? So these two guys came on, very unique skill sets, and they started to make these films. And what they said was, we have a brain trust, so we'll assign a director out of the brain trust, and that person is responsible for the everything to do with this film and how this film gets done from a creative standpoint. However, they are not in this alone. The brain trust will review everything that's going on and give honest and forthright feedback as to whether the story is headed in the right direction or maybe not headed in the right direction. And this is where probably the 22 storytelling rules come from, is what the brain trust was saying was like, you got to abide by these kind of rules if you want to do this. One of the key components of the brain trust was you never take you don't take responsibility away from the director in terms of the choices that are made. So everyone gives this really honest feedback about where the film is and how the film is going, and if that scene doesn't really fit emotionally, kind of like what Walt used to do with his animators, but the brain trust did it. But we never take the film away from the director unless we all agree that the director is so far out in left field that they will never finish this film and do a good job of finishing it. So you gave the responsibility to the director, but the brain trust was there to support that director and give them the best possible story outcome that it could possibly be.
So the feedback, they would give their honest feedback, but it was up to the director to act on that feedback or not.
Exactly right. Exactly right. It was all up to the director to do that. And so you can imagine you have this this is a competitive advantage that Hollywood does not have, because again, script lock, pre-production, production, it's done. You maybe get a few reshoots, but you can't iterate in the middle of it. You can't have a group of amazing storytellers go, this isn't really resonating that well. What if you made this character this way, or what if you did this character this way? That was a huge differentiator in the marketplace. Pixar could move and adapt and change things on the fly. I say on the fly.
And I remember that actually, and a very good example of that was going back to Finding Nemo. They were all in like the conference room / little mini theater is what I call it, and they're like looking at like the rough animation of it being done. So at the end scene where Marlin is confronting Nemo, when Nemo is laying on the ocean floor after getting all the fish out of the net and what have you, that the animator that was working on that scene didn't have Nemo connect eye-to-eye contact with his dad. And they were saying, that he made him look like he was dead while Marlin was talking to him. So it was something so small but yet so significant, and it was a different impact. So it actually showed the animator going back and making those changes. And then that's how we get the final product of, you see the father and son connecting at the end and seeing eye to eye, of Marlin accepting the fact, of Nemo, and Nemo apologizing for, how mean he was to his father in the beginning. So it was, again, like that connection things. But they only did that because of that essential, meetup in the conference room.
Yeah, exactly. And so just to finish out a little bit of the history, because I think it matters in terms of the process that was put into place by the experts at Pixar while they were at the height of their storytelling prowess, if you will. That was set up. That was under Apple's purview. Apple owned Pixar. Eventually, there's a lot more that I'm skipping over. So go read the book. It's a fantastic book. A lot more that I'm skipping over, but one of the things that was happening was that at the same time Pixar was on its meteoric rise, Disney animation was struggling immensely. It was having a very difficult time operating. A lot of their movies were coming out and were not doing very well. And so one of the things that I believe it was Iger at the time, Iger was looking at was it could have been Eisner, but I don't think so. I think it was Iger. Do you remember OG?
Iger came in in 2006.
2006. So when did Disney buy Pixar? This is what I'm going to look at.
2006.
That was under Iger.
Okay, so Iger
Pixar was under Iger.
So one thing that we know that Iger is great at is he's great at bringing in IP to help out with the situation that he's faced with, right? So what he did was he said, if I have the Pixar folks teach the Disney folks how to do this process, maybe we can improve our films. That was basically the theory. Now, there was two problems that came up immediately after, very quickly after that. One, Ed Catmull retired. So one of the founders of the whole company decided he was going to retire. And two, John Lasseter got in trouble. So two of the very people who set up the process that created a wild differentiator within Hollywood suddenly are not at Pixar anymore. Right. And so you have to. So I just think that that's a good backdrop to keep in mind of it's not just about I'm going to give OG all the power in the world to make whatever movie he wants to make. And it's going to be phenomenal. Right. No,
right.
It takes OG and the brain trust of Evan and the brain trust of Citrus George and bringing in Jay and saying, now let's tell OG what's working and what's not working and support him in his best movie possible. Those are some of the things that make for great stories. This is a very collaborative environment. And so I think that's a good backdrop to say it's not just about this person or that person. It's also about the system that's been set up around those people to bring about success.
So essentially, if I do my George mathematics here, so if you take Iger plus IP times that by Disney Animation plus Pixar minus Ed Catmull minus Lasseter equals we're fucked.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah, which is the name of the new Pixar film, actually.
There you go.
He's going in a very different direction. No, I'm kidding. But yeah, that could be some of the math. So to test that math, everything that you guys said I loved. Everything that you guys talked about with Onward and with Finding Nemo. I forgot that Finding Dory. I was watching a show yesterday. I was watching Disney Jeopardy. Shout out to the folks over at Disney Jeopardy, and they did. They said that Finding Dory was $1 billion film. I had forgotten that Finding Dory was $1 billion film. Yeah, it made $1 billion.
I was going to say, do we really want to remember that?
But that was during the 2016 era where everything was like making money regardless of.
Yeah.
Everything was hitting $1 billion back then.
Man, Finding Dory is a movie. I forgot that.
It's a movie.
It was a movie. We forgot it just like Dory forgets everything. We just forgot about it.
Exactly. I do have a drop though for Finding Dory. Give me 1 second.
Yeah. Make the drop happen.
Here we go. This is for Finding Dory.
Brand new money, brand new hundreds, got a bunch of zeros like a bag of new Funyuns.
A lot of zeros like a bag of Funyuns, man. Finding Dory.
You have to admit it. Okay, so let's go through these. So we're going to test out some of these. We all have some theories about why the storytelling dropped off. Could have been a process issue. Could have been a people issue. Could have been that they lost their way. One of the things we're going to do is we're going to take every single one of the 22 rules. We've got about an hour left in this conversation, so we've got plenty of time. And we're going to compare how the rule was followed with WALL-E and with Lightyear. Really quickly, why did I pick those two films? I did some research on Metacritic about what were some of the highest rated films, the lowest rated films. The critics and the audience members don't agree on all of them, right? Ooh. But in general, WALL-E is considered one of the best, and in general, Lightyear is considered one of the worst. So it may not be what you would consider the best or the worst, but it's kind of in the ballpark of what generally people think. So let's go through this.
I'm glad we're doing Good Dinosaur, or we're doing Lightyear, because I didn't watch Good Dinosaur, and I hear that's the worst one.
I liked Good Dinosaur. I liked Good Dinosaur, and I know a lot of people did not like it, and I was kind of always, but maybe my expectations were low going in because everyone said how terrible it was, and I was like, oh, maybe,
Yeah.
But who knows? Okay, so let's start out with this. The number one rule, and I don't think these are necessarily in order, but I'm going to go ahead and take them in order that they've got here. The number one rule that we're going to associate here is you admire a character for trying more than their successes. So you admire them for trying more than what they achieved by the end of the film. And so if you take Wall-E and you take Lightyear, OG, what do you think about that? Are both succeeding at that?
No, because I think, okay, I don't think Buzz was a very likable character in that movie. I just don't. I mean, very bland, that whole movie to me was just like all the way through it was very dystopian, like from beginning to end to me. It was very kind of like dystopian. I don't think Buzz was a very dynamic character in that.
Don't they usually have a topical cream for that?
Yeah, exactly. They do. They do.
Wow.
Yeah. But so like it's hard to admire the character or like the character more than his successes because he's not a very likable character, you know? So with Wall-E, it's a completely different situation. Like you can't help but fall in love with that thing. I mean, it's adorable. It's an extremely likable character. So even if Wall-E fails or Wall-E doesn't necessarily succeed in what he's accomplishing, you still feel for that character because you like the character, you know? It works. With Lightyear, it's like he was bland. So like you didn't really care as much. You weren't as invested. So I think Wall-E did a much better job at this one.
Okay. George, what do you think?
Yeah, I agree with OG. Right off the bat, when you take a character like Wall-E, his initial purpose is to basically gather up trash, stock it up, pile it up, keep doing it day in and day out. Where the genius part of that was in time, by collecting all this trash, he became very curious and he ended up developing a personality. So whether or not it was significant to the initial storyline moving forward, right out of the gate at the very beginning of the movie, it allowed people to, as OG said, fall in love with this character. So when the storyline does continue, you then want to root for him because it's out of a way of innocence that he just finds these little things and he gets so curious, like, ooh, what's this? What's that? What does this do? You know, and he becomes so intrigued and fascinated with these objects that it allows us to be open and vulnerable to say, okay, how is this story going to play out as it projects when he meets Eve and then he follows her onto the spaceship and what have you. So I thought that was a genius way that Andrew Stanton kind of propelled the storyline by starting it off by let's just focus on the character. You know, it has no relevance to the story whatsoever. So let's make a little monologue of like him playing with different things and finding things. And then that's when he starts watching the video of, My Fair Lady. Was it My Fair Lady?
Hello, Dolly.
Hello, Dolly. Then you start to see, okay, he's starting to kind of have this personality that, okay, I would like to find somebody and have this kind of relationship with and what have you. On the other spectrum of Lightyear, I feel like they did the complete opposite because what they did was they started the movie out by saying, okay, this is a movie of a movie that Andy watched that got him into liking the action figure of Buzz Lightyear. While the Buzz Lightyear action figure was more interesting in the Toy Story franchise. So if you watch the film of Lightyear, I'm thinking, isn't Andy crazy? How could he end up loving this film? Because I can't stand it. So it's like, because the character of Buzz as a person rather than an action figure was very dry, and it didn't have that same aesthetic quality as the Buzz in the Toy Story franchise.
Yeah, the toy was a more interesting character than the character that it's based on. It didn't work at all. Yeah.
What do you think, Evan? You think you in line with these guys? You think that Wall-E succeeds where Lightyear doesn't on this point?
Definitely. And I think Wall-E doesn't succeed a lot in his movie, especially when it comes to his relationship with Eve. There's a little push and pull there. It's not 100% successful, but we're vibing with it. We're interested in it exactly because what George says, because we get that time with Wall-E alone, we can understand who he is as a character, his curiosity. Then we like seeing his successes and failures with Eve and towards saving everybody, really, towards the end of the movie. And even for Lightyear, I think this is unsuccessful in a variety of different ways, but primarily in Lightyear, he fails a lot. Like one of the primary parts of Lightyear is him failing to get back home. It happens a lot. but I'm bored by it because I'm not really interested in Buzz as a character. Like, we love these Pixar movies for their connections, and the point of Lightyear was that he wasn't able to form these connections because of the influence of time and everything that happened in that case. So I think the dystopia and the time of it all really took away from, like, the setting kind of took away from what made or what could have made Buzz an interesting character in that movie, because he's not bouncing off of anybody really. It's just him alone, which could work. It worked for Wally. It just didn't work for Buzz here because he's just a bland character whose arc wasn't really that fulfilling by the end. So I didn't really connect with his failures to get back home as much as other movies like Wally.
Yeah, I am in agreement with all three of you guys. So I think that this is a clear failure to achieve the point number one. And I would just double down on a couple of things that you guys have already kind of said, but I'll say it in kind of a different way. Wally starts out, and Wally is the underdog from the very beginning. He's the ugly robot. He doesn't look as cool as Eve looks. Like, he's got a road to go to get to what he would really emotionally fulfill him, right? Having a relationship with Eve, getting away from the dump, all of that kind of stuff, taking care of the plant. All of those things are very difficult for him because he is literally a trash bin of a droid, right? Like, he's not much more than that. The counterpoint to that is, like you said, Evan, and you said, George, both of them are doing things where they're failing a lot, right? Like, so Wally's kind of just going along doing his day-to-day work, and it doesn't really amount to much. It's not very important. On the other hand, Lightyear is a guy who's got it all together. He's a good-looking guy that everyone thinks is a superhero, right? So when you see him failing over and over and over again, what it does from an audience perspective, in my mind, and I think this is where some of, I'm not a fan of the that's woke criticism, because I think that that's just so arbitrary. It's it doesn't make any sense. It doesn't add up when you compare movies about, like, a movie that's way more woke that everyone loved, that you just said that this one's woke and you hated it. Like, it doesn't make any sense. However, one of the things I think that can happen is if you make your character this idealistic character, and you say this character is really awesome, and that character does nothing but fail, then you go, it does set it up for, like, I'm not endeared to that character. I don't care if a frat boy fails over and over again. In fact, I'm kind of happy that a frat boy continues to fail. But the nerd, I'm rooting for, right? Like, the nerd, I'm like, I hope the nerd makes it to the next stage. And so I think one of the problems that, and I use the term, like, when it starts to get criticized for woke, in relationship to the, let's just call him the white male hero character, is then you just make him fail a bunch of times, and then people are going like, well, are you just making fun? Are you just making fun of this character? But it's not fun. This is not a fun process. And I think that's where you can get into some of these things where you say how you set the character up and what the character's goals are to achieve matter. Evan, you said, I don't care if he gets home, right? Like, that doesn't matter to us. It matters if Wally finds love with Eve. That matters to us a lot, right? And so when you see a really successful, cool character, it's very difficult for the audience to find themselves in that character, because very few people, even the people that are out there that seem like they have no self-esteem issues, the root of them has a self-esteem issue, and they're not sure exactly how to address that. But if you just make the cool character, it's very hard to endear ourselves to that very cool character, even if they go on to fail over and over and over again. And so I just don't think it works there. Go ahead, Evan.
And one last point, too. I think my favorite Pixar movie is The Incredibles, and I think they play on that, right? Mr. Incredible in the first 5 minutes is like, he's doing everything. He's literally saving a cat from a tree. He's so good at everything. But they play on that. They say, like, okay, what if this man who's so good at everything had a family and he's not very good with his family? They make us connect with it on that level, right? On a familiar, on a universal level that we can all relate to. And I think that was kind of absent in Lightyear.
100%.
Totally agree. So they fail on number one in terms of Lightyear. So that is not a good start. It's not a good start for the latest version of Pixar. Let's go to the point number two, which is you got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. They can be very different. So you have to think with the audience in mind, not what you want to do with your writing. Evan, I'll start with you this time. Do you think Wall-E captured that, and do you think Lightyear captured that?
Well, let me see here. I think what's interesting about that, I think the quote, I don't fully agree with the quote. It is an interesting quote. You always got to think about your audience. But I always say, like, if you're writing something, do what you want to do, and you got to hope that the audience is there for it. So I think there needs to be a balance there most of the time. It depends. But anyways, I think for Wally's case, I think it is very successful at doing that. You kind of do what's interesting towards the audience in terms of giving them familiar and universal themes. Audiences can really relate to that. And they can't really relate to a lot of the things in Lightyear. And that's kind of what we were talking about there with relatability in terms of your thematic storytelling. And that's what kind of you got to think about the audience there. Because what was the audience for Lightyear? That was a difficulty with marketing that movie. You want to market it as a sci-fi dystopian movie, but it's also related to this franchise that everybody loves. But also it's very heady and very sci-fi, and there's a lot of time shenanigans going on. So that weird disconnectivity there that was happening with the marketing really isolated the audience, and that's kind of resulted in the box office there.
Yeah, that's a really good way of saying that. George, what do you think?
Yeah, I do agree with Evan. At some point there does need to be an equal balance. As a writer, you have to write firmly what you believe in and the story that you want to tell, but also want to captivate the audience as well. But having said that, I feel for Lightyear, I felt like that came at a time where Pixar wasn't doing so hot, so it's like, okay, let's take a character from a beloved franchise and let's do a little spin on it. Right. So whether or not, as the points that Evan had made, is this a sci-fi type of movie? Is this an action adventure type of movie? Well, it's like, well, who cares? Because it's based off of a character from a beloved franchise, people will go see it. So it's almost like that they kind of wanted to gear towards more of the audience perspective. But I felt like that's what actually hurt Lightyear because of the way of thinking, rather than say, okay, let's entertain the audience by a great story with great characters. Well, no, let's entertain the audience just by drawing them into the theater because this is a character that they recognize and they relate to, just on a different type of format, so to speak. For Wall-E, I felt like, honestly, you kind of got the best of both worlds for the writer and for the audience, because again, it's a story that, even though it's about a little robot that ends up falling in love with another robot, on top of trying to save the universe and save the ecosystem and the environmental, type of language that's in there with this little plant in a boot, but we all can, at some point in that movie, relate to that storyline. We could relate to those characters, and again, it's a character that we want to root for. Where with Lightyear, again, it's like you look at Buzz and you just find him obnoxious. It's like, and that's the best kind of two characters. It's like Wall-E doesn't say anything, but he doesn't have to say anything because his actions, you love him. It's almost like Grogu. It's like he kind of has like that Wall-E factor. It's like, you just watch the actions and it's like he's so lovable. Just the characteristics play through the actions. Where with Buzz, it's like you look at him and it's like, for how many times he's trying to get home, I wish that he would just land in a convent and take the vow of silence. It's like, so based off of that, I felt like Wall-E did both. It was geared towards the writer for Andrew Stanton. Andrew Stanton did a phenomenal job with Wall-E. Yeah. And then with Lightyear, I felt like it was geared towards the audience, but not for the purpose that it should have been geared towards the audience.
It's interesting. Okay, so it says here, you got to keep in mind what's interesting to you as an audience, not what's fun to do as a writer. And I think this is a big problem for Lightyear, especially because you're dealing with source material, right? Like for Wall-E, you can kind of take a little more liberty with that, I think. But when you're making a movie based on an existing character, you can't get too loosey-goosey with you as a writer. You have to follow what this character is, the essence of this character, because that's what it's modeled after. And I think Lightyear failed spectacularly in this, because I think the writer went too far with their own vision of the character that when you watch the movie, it's not even like the same character. It's completely different than like you can't even believe, like we talked earlier, like this is the character that Andy was like in love with. It doesn't really jive. It doesn't really equate. It just feels so off, you know. With Wall-E, it's with what Evan was saying, it deals with a lot of human human elements in that story, relationships and what have you. So it's very relatable. He's a very likable character, so it's fun. We have a good time following little Wall-E around. It's like George says, like Grogu. I mean, you could watch this thing all day long, you know? So yeah, I think Wall-E did a much better job with that fun factor. And I think that Lightyear, I mean, they just took way too much liberty because it was that existing character. If this was a new original film, a new original concept, you can do that. You know, if this was like a Pixar movie based on some different character, like a sci-fi thing, you can get away with that freedom as a writer a little bit more. In this case, you got to follow the source material, and they just didn't.
Actually, you make a great point, OG, because if you actually look back at the storyline of Lightyear, of even going back to the character of Zurg ended up becoming Lightyear many, many, many years later, where if you go back to Toy Story 2, it was proclaimed that Zurg was Buzz's father, you know, sort of kind of like a play off of Star Wars.
Right.
You know, and then it's like he destroys himself, which I guess you can kind of look at it as a, you know, like a metaphoric type of term where it's like he destroys a piece of himself, of that arrogance and that will to succeed. I can understand it. But in all actuality, you know, if Back to the Future taught us anything, you make one little alter change, you know, of the future, it's like it's going to alter your own present. So it's like to destroy yourself, you know, it just, the storyline for Lightyear was just all over the place. And it's like, it was something that was trying to make sense, but didn't. And I don't even think like young kids would even understand it. You know, if we as adults can't understand it, it's like, it can't be geared towards children to have a clear vision. Like, you really think that Andy would have understood that as a child watching that in a VHS tape, you know, and it's like
there's a disconnect for sure.
Yeah. Really quickly before I say what I'm going to say, I do have to give a disclaimer. One, we are not out to get Pixar. We all four of us love Pixar. Okay, so this is not a podcast for us to like just complain about Pixar. I am going to complain about Pixar in a minute. That's not the intent. I also, you know, one of our board members here at our production company just was interviewing Pete Docter on a podcast like the other day. So my I would rather work with Pete Docter than criticize Pete Docter any day of the week, right? Like this is not a hit piece on Pixar. What we are trying to do is we're trying to cognitively understand what the difference is. That's all we're trying to do. We're not critiquing just because we want to be negative. We're critiquing because we want to, our minds want to understand storytelling better. Pixar has been so amazing at it. Okay, disclaimer done. I could not agree with you guys more. The whole concept is actually breaking this rule. And you guys have kind of hinted at this already. And I'm just going to say it. The whole concept breaks the rule because it is more fun for a writer to say, what if this was Lightyear and Lightyear was a guy and that's what we base the toy on? That's a writing concept. That is not an audience concept. No audience person said, man, I'd love to see the movie about Buzz Lightyear as a dude. Like, right? Like nobody said that. And so this is a fun writing exercise that they turned into a movie, and the audience wasn't there for it. The audience was not there for that concept shift. And so I think you guys are all right. Everything you said is based off that definition of the concept doesn't really work. Now, some of these we can't actually tell because it's more of a process, an internal process thing that we don't know how it happened. And the next one's a little bit like that, right? Trying for theme is important, but you won't see what the story is actually about until you're at the end of it, and then you rewrite. We're not going to address that one. It's an internal process thing. We don't know when the theme of the movie started to bubble up to the surface.
Right.
Makes sense, though.
Yeah, it's a good rule. It's a really good rule, but we don't know how that actually played out, so we'll skip that one. And I'm going to skip the next one, too, just because there's once upon a time there was blank, every day blank, one day blank, because of that blank, because of that blank, until finally blank. That's sort of the structure that they're aiming for. Anybody have a comment on that? Comparing Wall-E.
If a writer wrote that, they're doing something terribly wrong.
No. It's a little inside baseball. Absolutely. Go ahead.
Yeah. Like, again, it seems very structured and very like these are core tenets, and if you follow it, that could work. But again, you shouldn't be beholden to something like this.
Exactly.
But this next one is a good one for us because this one we can tell based on what came out in theaters and what came out on video. Number 5 is simplify, focus, combine characters, hop over detours. You'll feel like you're losing valuable stuff, but it sets you free. So did Wall-E accomplish that? Did it simplify? Did it focus? Did it combine characters? Did it hop over detours? And then Lightyear as well. George, why don't you kick us off?
Sure. So with Wall-E, I definitely feel like it does because as I mentioned before, the start of the film is just Wall-E by himself, where we get to know his personality, we get to know his character, and then sooner or later he ends up meeting Eve. He follows her up on the spaceship, where then he gets kind of caught up where even though he is following her, that was his sole purpose. And then it becomes an even bigger purpose where he then becomes the little hero of the day, so to speak, where he has a greater value and a greater purpose than just falling in love. So there's a romantic side to his goal, and then a goal to actually basically save the environment, so to speak, where he then becomes a character and then do at the end that almost became his demise of how Eve then actually finds a little more of a connection heart to Wall-E and ends up rebuilding him and him, becoming, reviving and what have you, and him interacting with the humans up on the ship and what have you. So I felt like that is where the detour part came for Wall-E and the interconnection between the characters. Now for Lightyear, again, I feel like it did have that formula in Lightyear, but it just wasn't successful. In a sense, for the detours of him, jumping through like how many times to try to get it right. He almost has like this Mission Impossible type of attitude. You got to hit it, you got to hit that mark right. And it's like, okay, well, let's retry it again and retry it again. And then sooner or later, life just passes him by. And then he intertwines with characters that are related to the people of his past. So it does, in a sense, he does go through these detours. He does have this inner exchange with other characters, but I felt like it just wasn't a strong enough type of connection and a strong enough storyline for it to compel to the audience like it did for Wall-E.
Yeah. Nice. What do you think, Evan?
I love this one. I think I'll stick with the combined characters part because that's what's very interesting to me. I think Pixar is very good at that, where they combine characters. You have Woody meeting Buzz. They're combining characters there. You have Wall-E meeting Eve. They're combining characters there. Mike meets Boo. You're combining characters there. You're combining two different characters who have two different arcs, but they're going to be combined in a way that affects them individually and as a unit. And hopping over detours in that sense, you don't really need a lot of Pixar movies. That's what the beauty of it is. They're taking risks because common storytelling is, hey, characters go on a journey. There's a detour. They have to figure it out, and then resolution happens. That's a normal, storytelling thing. But for Pixar, they kind of make the detours associate with the characters themselves, the combined characters. They kind of simplify it. They're like, okay, we don't need a universal detour. We're going to have detours that affect the individual characters. In Wall-E and Eve's case, it's like the case of like what happens in space and the detour of, the human interactions and all that kind of stuff. Like, oh crap, this is a exterior force that we kind of didn't predict. And I like this kind of stuff. It sets you free and it makes your story more valuable and more interesting when you combine the characters, have them go on a journey together. Wherein, again, Lightyear, he doesn't have that character to combine himself with, really. I mean, he has the dog, which is a character. But or whatever that was. Was it a dog? I don't know.
I think it was a cat, little like robotic cat or
Yeah.
something.
Oh yeah.
A cat,
Sort of,
dog, rabbit, would all in the same. That story still sucked.
But it's like there wasn't any interesting character dynamics
Right.
in Lightyear when that kind of set Wall-E apart for the better.
100%. Yeah, I was actually going to bring that up too, Evan, about the cat. See, that felt very formulaic to me, right? It's like, okay, we got this really dark dystopian kind of movie, right? we got to get some comedy relief in there. What can we do? Okay, we'll do a robotic cat. It's like, it feels like a very, like, almost like a corporate decision, and they really fell flat with that, with the combined character thing. Like, like Evan said, Pixar is typically very successful at that, like Mike and Sully, or, even Wall-E, you can say Marlon and Dory. I mean, you had these dynamics that were super, super interesting, and Lightyear just did not have that. They just didn't have it at all. It felt very forced, in my opinion. Simplify. That's another one. With Wall-E, it feels it's that human element. It's like I said so many times. It's about relationships. And it just feels it's like just this very core kind of human kind of message. I don't really feel it. Feels very muddled and kind of messy with Lightyear. It doesn't feel as focused and sharp like it does with Wall-E. So yeah, I think that again with this one, and I think this is going to be a trend here with these. Wall-E comes out on top, big time. The story for me, the story with the storyline for Lightyear just felt kind of messy to me compared to how sharp and focused Wall-E was. It lost that simplicity big time.
I think both of the films are interesting in that they kind of start with an isolated character who then joins like a sort of a team, like a little bit of a team, and then the bigger world sort of opens up a little bit more, so you start to see all of the interactions in that world. Wall-E is more effective at it. I do agree with you guys that Wall-E is more effective at it. It makes me wonder a little bit if you call a show. We talked about this. We all talked about this on Ahsoka, by the way. Go watch our Ahsoka episodes if you're interested in those. Those were fantastic. Really fun to do. When you name the show, when you name the movie Lightyear, when you name the show Ahsoka, I do believe that it is supposed to be a movie about that character. But what's interesting about Lightyear is that the area where it actually gets a little less simplified is when he gets the team. And all of a sudden it's like, well, is this about Lightyear anymore? Because it seems like it's more, these characters are actually more interesting than he is. And it seems to me like the storytellers wanted those characters to be the heroes as opposed to the character that they named the movie after. It's almost kind of like we get to do the movie because we named it Lightyear, but we really like this little group of characters that we found that's actually kind of cooler than Lightyear even is. And by the way, they're the underdogs, by the way. They all their quirks and issues that they have. So I do agree with you guys, although I think it's harder for me to pinpoint exactly where it went wrong. I'm not exactly sure, but it seems to be in the setup or the concept again to me. So
yeah, I think it's a conceptual thing for Lightyear. And in all intents and purposes, it wasn't a simple movie. They kind of overcomplicated it with its sci-fi themes. And I agree with you too by the characters, by the way. The characters are kind of interesting, but just like Ahsoka, they didn't let them cook long enough. And I kind of lost interest.
Exactly. This next one is a really good one because we can identify this one for sure. I'll start with you, OG. The rule is, what is your character good at, comfortable with? Throw the polar opposite at them, challenge them. How do they deal? How do you think both movies handled that?
That's an interesting one. Wow, this is a tough one. Okay, so for Lightyear, he's sort of like this, like you were saying, Jay, like this kind of like, well, at the beginning, he's very much like this winner, and he feels very comfortable in that. You throw the polar opposite at him, which is losing. See, that's the thing. It's like when you get to that point where he's kind of losing, I kind of don't care. It kind of goes back to that one of the first ones we were talking about. I kind of don't care. He's not interesting enough for me to care at that point. whether he loses or wins. With Wally, I don't know. I feel
your investment in the character, so to speak, like as the story carries on, it's almost like your investment to that character, as you said, OG. It's like whether for Lightyear in that point, whether he wins or lose, it's like, okay, I'm not at the edge of my seat wondering like, okay, is he going to succeed? But with Wally, you do. It's like the complete polar opposite.
Right, exactly. You're much more intrigued with Wally's decision-making process and everything and how he handles these circumstances because he's more likable. It comes down to likability. I mean, it really does in a lot of ways. So, yeah, I don't really feel like Lightyear handled this very well because I don't feel like I didn't care really at the end of the day what Lightyear was doing. I didn't care if he succeeded or not. So yeah, I think Wally came out on top on this one.
And just to kind of pin off of what OG was saying, but also what Evan said before when he was saying what his favorite Pixar movie was, The Incredibles. See, The Incredibles actually provide that more than Lightyear did.
Right.
Where it's like when you have these characters and you kind of see them interchange throughout the story, whether it's a story within a story, and you see this everyday family that are doing these normal daily family things, but they're supers. So it's like tying in the real life everyday family struggles with being a super. And then by the end of the movie where everything starts to come to a head, it's like you gain the satisfaction of understanding these characters. You know their individual personalities. You know how they feed off of one another. So it's like you're rooting for them. Especially one of my favorite scenes in The Incredibles is when they're driving to get to the location to fight off the giant robot, and Elastigirl and Mr. Incredible, they're fighting over which direction to go. I mean, that is like the typical husband and wife on the road, take this exit. No, you're going to miss it. Turn here, turn that way. But it's also to the fact of they're super, so they're trying to get to the location. But again, it's that realism that comes in.
Relatability.
Again, exactly. So not only are you rooting for them to win as supers, you're like rooting for them. It's like, okay, as a married couple, as a husband and wife, it's like, okay, let's do this together, sort of thing.
Yeah,
that has the more likability with The Incredibles as opposite of Lightyear, because you have these two films that they're based off of as a superhero type of adventure quality, but The Incredibles checks all those boxes off where Lightyear doesn't.
Yeah.
This is so fascinating. I think Lightyear actually does a decent job with this rule number 6 here. What is Lightyear comfortable with? He's comfortable with success. And like OG said, he fails a lot in this movie. So you're throwing him in a situation where that he's not used to. And I do think the best part of Lightyear is similar to Up, which I'm not the biggest Up fan, by the way. But similar to Lightyear and Up, it kind of like the best parts are early on. And when he's failing, I don't really connect with that, but when I see his other characters getting older and like dying, I'm like, oh shit, like that's kind of sad. But I connect with it on a exterior way, not really through Lightyear. It's kind of an interesting experience there. But anyways, throwing the polar opposite at them for Lightyear, what wasn't then successful was then the antagonist being himself, where it's himself older, of course, and he has a different prerogative on life, where Lightyear has learned by the end to value the human experience and friends and connections, while his older version kind of like begrudges all that. They're cooking there. It's interesting a little bit, but it doesn't go the full mile for me. It doesn't really connect on a whole thematic level for me, which loses interest. He's not challenged to the degree that I wanted him to be. It's too simple. But for Wally, this is perfect for Wally, because he's comfortable with living on his daily routine, and what he's not comfortable with is going to space, having his whole setting changed, having somebody else be with him. Like Eve, even though she's the romantic connection, she's also the person that he's initially not comfortable with, in a sense. Like, right, he has to slowly connect with her and he has to slowly, have this push and pull relationship that he's not used to. And that discovery is what makes Wall-E so interesting. That simple challenge in regards to character dynamics is what makes it so interesting. You're so on board with what Wall-E or how Wall-E is trying to unravel this connection with Eve that goes through the whole movie. So yeah, that's what I like about it. So I think, and all be all, I think Lightyear is actually kind of good at this, but it just doesn't go the full mile for me.
That's fair.
That's good stuff.
Yeah.
This is, I'm going to go off of a few shows ago. It was not a Story Geek show. It was an Orange Nerd show. I went off about propaganda and storytelling. I did a whole diatribe about how much I dislike it. I think it matters here. Notice that Wall-E is dealing with a theme of classism. Wall-E is a garbage droid who rises to the occasion to save the world. He saves the world for a bunch of people who are so lazy that they literally have lost the ability to walk. This is the upper class. This is the aristocracy. They can just do whatever they want to, and they're so enamored with their screens, and they yet are slowly dying because of it. And the character who showcases the most amount of emotion and a love for something that basically transforms everyone by the end of the movie, so they realize like relationships matter more than all this stuff that we're doing, these dumb screens that we're looking at. It's really, really important. That message is embedded in a story that is about a robot, that is about the human experience, even though it is robots that they're dealing with. And it's also something that is earned. It's earned. We see Wall-E. They show us Wall-E. He's in the trenches. We know that his job is needed, but we also know that we see him find the love. We see him find, well, first of all, he finds the plant and he's taking care of the plant, and then Eve comes and then he falls in love with Eve. Everything that it gets is earned in the story. Right. They don't have to tell us at some point in time, like, classism is really important and you shouldn't be a jerk to the garbage droid because he's going to save your life. Like, they don't tell us that. They show us that. It's perfect. Yes. It's ideal. Exactly. It's not propaganda. I think that there's a little bit more in Lightyear. And again, I don't agree with the comments that Lightyear is woke. I don't agree with those comments.
I don't either. Yeah.
It's not.
But I'm addressing them because what I want to do is, one of my goals in doing this show is to bring disparate ideas from different kinds of people and explain to them why that idea probably exists in their mind, but contextualize it to say it's not woke. It's not woke that they do this. It's, but I understand why you are struggling with it, because Lightyear takes a different idea and Lightyear takes a different concept where it says, here is this lead character, but this lead character who we've always thought of as being kind of cool, but also a little bit of a bumbling guy. Like, he thinks he's something special when he's just a toy and he doesn't realize he's just a toy. Let's take that character, make him a human. Now we're not dealing with robots anymore. We're dealing with literal humans. And then let's make him struggle so much that the lesson he needs to learn is that he needs to rely on other people to be able to get the job done, right? And I think that I don't think that there's any inherent propaganda in Lightyear that I could see, which is why I'm saying it's not woke, right? Right. But what there is that there is a specific calling out of human beings interacting with the world in such a way that people might be able to derive in, and it might be intended by the storytellers to showcase, like, the white male patriarchy should not be able to just overcome everything on their own. They should rather learn how to interact with the whole group. I think that message is really awkward though in Lightyear, because literally it's like, you're the white male patriarchy and you keep failing, so you need to work with other people. But then it's like, no, but you actually just need to lead all those other people. And it's like, well, then you just set up the patriarchy again. So I understand why some people could put the woke label on it, not understanding what the story was attempting to do. I don't think the story is actually woke, because I've looked at it from that standpoint. I don't think it's true. To me, the definition of woke means that the propaganda is inherent in the film, which is why I complained about that line from Turning Red so much.
What line?
The "My Body, My Choice" line when the girl is just wearing what she wore to school.
Yeah.
That to me is propaganda because that was not part of the storytelling. That was a joke that they decided to put in that was never going to resonate with a pro-life audience, right? Like you chose what you wanted to do there and you did it. And okay, that's fine. That's propaganda. I don't see propaganda in Lightyear. I just think that the way that Lightyear is set up is awkward and it doesn't really work with anybody. Because if you're a person of color watching, you're going, why do we need the white guy to lead us to everything? And if you're a white male watching, you're like, why is this guy such an idiot, right? Like, so it's just there's just a lot of awkwardness in that setup where Wall-E doesn't have any of that. No. Wall-E criticized culture. Wall-E said you guys are becoming more obese and staring at more screens, and we all went, this is the greatest story of all time. Like
he's right.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that there is there's some artistry to Wall-E that's missing in Lightyear. And I'm not exactly sure why, but it has to do with some of those choices that were made in the setups of those films.
The subtlety sometimes. Yeah. Sometimes you say more with less, you know?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly.
One of my favorite animation studios, Ghibli, Miyazaki stuff. And that's all about, like, they're very blatant with their, like, themes of classism, poverty, and everything like that. But they're told, similar to Pixar, or at least a good part of Pixar, is the execution, how they're able to portray these things through the setting, through the story, through the characters in a way that's very blatant, but ways that you can agree with and ways that you can relate to. It's all about execution.
Yeah, it's so true. It's so true. I'm going to skip a couple of these because these, again, are kind of behind the scenes stuff, but I do want to read them to you so you are familiar with what Pixar is saying as their 22 storytelling rules. Number 7 is come up with your ending before you figure out your middle. Seriously, endings are hard. Get yours working up front. We obviously don't know if they did that or not, so we won't address it. Number 8 is finish your story. Let it go, even if it's not perfect. In an ideal world, you would have both, meaning it's perfect and it's finished, but move on, do better next time. Basically, that's a failure thing. If Pixar, with the story, they couldn't get it right, they would just toss it and move to the next one, right? So that's basically what that's referring to. Number 9 is if you're stuck, make a list of what wouldn't happen next. Lots of times the material to get you unstuck will show up if you kind of reverse that, as opposed to thinking of what could happen next. Think of like what would not happen next, and then that's guide you down the right path. Yeah,
they're like reverse engineering it. That's pretty.
Every
cool.
one of these rules is fantastic. By the way, it's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk about this. It's not something that we can assess with the two movies necessarily, but it's still. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to bring up the process aspect of this conversation, because there's all this stuff that happens behind the scenes that is probably changed, and we don't have an insight into what that.
And this is really a good inside information for anybody who wants to write their own story or create something. So this is a good set of tools on a platform to kind of hand it to you to say, okay, follow these steps if you want to have a good formula to write a good story.
Yeah, that's good.
Well, for which I actually am in the midst of writing something myself, which I am actually using one of these tools of writing the end and then working backwards, which I actually got that from J.K. Rowling when she did that with the Harry Potter series. She already had the ending already fixed. So it's like, okay, now you got to do everything in between to get to that final ending, which you already know how you want it to end, which I find completely genius.
Yeah, that's perfect. That's perfect. I'm going to go through a couple more of these because we're going to get to some that matter a lot to the finished product, and I want to focus a little bit more on those because we're going to run out of our time a little bit here. But so I'm going to go through these, but I'm going to go through them pretty fast till we get to some of the ones that I think are really, really critical that we needed to address. Number 10 is pull apart the stories you like. What you like in them is part of you. You've got to recognize it before you can use it. So understanding where that's resonating with you as a storyteller to be able to put it in the story. And pulling apart the stories you like is literally the definition of the Story Geeks. So there you go. That's what we do. Number 11 is putting it on paper lets you start fixing it. If it stays in your head, a perfect idea, you'll never share it with anyone. So good for you, George, for putting it on paper.
Hey, real quick, Jay. Maybe that should be your tagline, dude. You know, like Story Geeks. Pull apart the stories you like. You know, that's the intro, man.
Yeah, that might be it. That might be it. And we'll do the motion we'll do is just pulling apart a loaf of bread. Like you know how George does the sticky thing. We'll just pull apart the loaf of bread. There you
go.
That'll be our big reveal there. Okay, number 12 is discount the first thing that comes to mind, and the second and third and fourth and fifth. Get the obvious out of the way. Surprise yourself. That's a good one too. That's a really good one. Now, here's where we get into some more interesting ones. So I do want to stop on some of these and pause so we can ask this question. Number 13 is give your characters opinions. Passive, malleable, might seem likable to you as you write, but it's poison to the audience. So, OG, what do you think about that? Do you think that the opinions of these characters mattered in Lightyear and WALL-E?
Yeah, they did actually. I think WALL-E. That's fascinating, dude. Make a yeah, because the likability thing. I've come to this like a million times with this already. But WALL-E, there's a vulnerability there. There's a likability there that I feel like Buzz doesn't have. You know, and he just comes off much more genuine. You know, I feel like Lightyear is sort of like this almost AI sort of like creation where it's like it's a very bland like computer created character, right? Where WALL-E feels a little bit more like there's some genuine heart in there. There's some genuine feelings and emotions. So yeah, I think they did a much better job with WALL-E for sure.
I think it's ironic because it's almost like the robot is more human and the human's more robotic.
I was just gonna say that. Yeah, it is kind of ironic, right? That the robot is actually feels more human, like more relatable than the human character is. So that was interesting. But it says here that it says what character might seem likable when you write it, but it's poison to the audience. See, I don't know. Okay, with that word poison, to be fair to Lightyear, I don't think that just because I feel like he's a bland character, I don't feel it was poison to the audience necessarily. I don't think we can go that far with it. I think it's more of like apathy from the audience. It's not really poison, you know. That's kind of where I'm at. I don't know.
Yeah, that's good. And I want to make one note. George said this to me in the private chat here we got going. And he said, why don't we just do a part 2? There's plenty of good stuff left to talk about. He's absolutely right. And in fact, in the part 2, we're going to take 2 different movies and address the rest of the questions with 2 different movies. So you got to be around for the part 2.
Absolutely.
Because we'll have to wrap it up here in about 10 minutes. But I want to finish out this question. So excellent analysis there, OG. I'm going to skip you, George. I'm going to go to Evan. Evan, what do you think? What do you think of this question and how WALL-E and Lightyear handle it?
I think they handle them in a variety of different ways. Well, first off, I think the quote is important because people confuse characters with bad opinions with bad characters, and I couldn't disagree more. I think there's a lot of time in my favorite shows and movies. They're like, "Oh, I couldn't disagree more with that character. Hate him." Like, okay, great. You're supposed to hate him. Like, that's what I like about certain characters. Like, if they're bad characters, not even antagonist wise, certain good characters can have opinions that you don't agree with as well. Like Woody in the first Toy Story wasn't always right, or Buzz, or any certain characters, right? But like you like those characters because you get to know them via their opinions. Characters giving their opinions lets you express who they are as like on an emotional level, right? And WALL-E, he can't really talk. He can't really give his opinion away, but you see his opinion via his actions and what he tried to do to save everybody towards the end of the movie, the way he kind of relates to Ava. He can express his opinion through his actions. That's what makes it so unique and fresh and interesting. Exactly. Meanwhile, for Lightyear, you can kind of get his opinion on stuff, but he leans toward that passive character because he reacts a lot of the movie. He's more of a reactionary character, which I'm not a huge fan of. Sometimes reactionary characters can work in fiction, but in this case, I don't think it really does for Lightyear. It kind of reacts to the setting and the circumstances that he's in and that kind of forces him to kind of evolve in terms of like, as Jay said earlier, it kind of forces him to realize, hey, I guess I do need friends. Where it's like, okay, we get that, but he's not really going about that through his own internal arc. It's just what is happening to him forces him to do this. So then he kind of like is like, okay, yeah, then I guess I need to do this and evolve that way. So he kind of passive there. And again, I don't think it's poison, but I think the poison word here is that it's not effective. It doesn't make people want to be interested in your story. I think that's what it is. Rather than just like, I hate it. It's just like, I'm not affected by it. I'm not moved by it. And that's a death knell. Because if your audience isn't moved, why are we here?
Beautifully said, Evan. Beautifully said.
Great stuff. Yeah, excellent stuff. George, what do you think? Tack on to what OG and Evan said here.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with them both. It's more in the sense of where when you go into a movie, whether you're watching it at home, whether you're going it in theaters, you're going in with the mindset that you're going to come out of the movie feeling a certain way, whether it's happy, whether it's curiosity, whether you're gonna come out feeling some way, and in order to feel that way, it's the relationship between honestly the audience and the characters. So as Evan had pointed out, where it's like you could have a main character, doesn't have to necessarily be antagonistic, but it's like you don't have to necessarily agree with them on a certain standpoint. But that's what makes them so relatable, because us as humans, we go day to day with people, we don't agree with, but we move, time moves on, you get through it. For instance, Carl Fredricksen from Up. It's like he kind of starts off from the loss of his wife. He's a bitter old grumpy man, and then it takes this young child that kind of opens him up, because this was a relationship that he never had, because he never had children throughout his life with Ellie, so it's like, so it put him in a position where it was completely foreign. But at some point or another, the audience can relate to that. They can relate to the reaction that Carl was having from the child, and opposite. So kind of going off of Wall-E and Lightyear, I feel like that's how Wall-E kind of connects to within his personality with all the characters that he meets throughout the story, for which with Lightyear, you can kind of see that, but it falls flat with the dynamic of the character arc itself. And again, with the term poison, to Evan's point, it feels like it's poison as in a sense of it being stale. It wasn't there enough to kind of captivate the audience.
And this just came to mind, and I know this is Pixar, but my favorite movie of the year is Oppenheimer. And I don't agree with a lot of Oppenheimer's opinions, but that's what makes him an interesting character, because he's giving an opinion on a ton of different things here that makes it very relatable and interesting and captivating.
Yeah. In fact, I'm glad you brought up Oppenheimer, because I'm going to bring up another couple things too. The first one I'm going to bring up, you probably will understand, because it's comparing Lightyear to Lightyear. When Buzz Lightyear shows up in Toy Story and throughout Toy Story, he's a very opinionated character. He has a way of thinking this is the way the world works, and we have to go get Emperor Zurg, and then Woody's like, that's not the way we do things. And then there's the literal difference of opinion is what makes the movie work, right? Like, it's the odd couple. Here, I don't know that we get a lot of personality from Lightyear in the form of opinions. Right. I think if we really were to dive into Lightyear, we could say, well, he has an opinion that he is going to be a merit-based character. And what he doesn't realize is merit only gets you so far in this world. You can only do so many things of your own merit and get very far. You need to have friends that help you get even farther. And I think that is it's interesting, but it's a very embedded opinion that they don't like tell you. It's inherent in his character, but he never goes around saying like, I don't need anybody else. He kind of does, I guess, to a certain extent, but it's not very in front of your face the way that it is in the actual Buzz Lightyear toy. To double down on what you guys were saying about characters, Succession has some of the best characters around. Succession could not be anything farther away from Pixar than I could think of, but Succession is a show that is literally based off of unlikable characters. You're not supposed to like a single one of them, but there are components to them that you do find compelling. You find that their opinions, although sometimes abhorrent, are also though things that you said, like, if I were in that position, I would kind of be thinking the same things, even if I wasn't supposed to, And so I think that there's these little elements of characters are awesome when they have flaws, because then we recognize them as human. I don't look at OG and think like he is the epitome of a perfect human. He's never made any mistakes in his life, right? I don't look at George that way. I'm sure I wouldn't look at Evan that way as well. I don't look at myself that way when I look in the mirror. I go, wow, here's a person with a lot of flaws. And so I think that when you give characters opinions, especially if they're based off of things that have happened to them in the past, some of their upbringing, that makes them very interesting to us, especially if they develop along the way. Like you guys have already talked about, Carl develops along the way. Is what makes him so interesting. And so I do believe that by the time you understand what Lightyear's opinions actually are, Buzz Lightyear's opinions in Lightyear, it's kind of like too late, because nothing endeared us to him before that.
Right.
And it's just kind of hard to take that. So fascinating part one of our conversation. We're going to find a time that we can get Evan back on the show to talk about part two. We'll compare a couple more movies, and we'll talk about like an earlier Pixar film to a later Pixar film and where we've gone with that. But I got to tell you, Lightyear didn't fare that well in comparison to WALL-E.
No, it's just not as an effective movie. WALL-E did a much better job all around. Delivering.
It's sort of like, I think OG uses this term quite some time. Not exactly, but I'll spin it off as my own. It's like when you go and you have a nice big juicy steak, that's WALL-E, and then you go to Lightyear, you get a McDouble,
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah,
exactly. It does the job, but it's not the same.
It's a nice little filler.
I'm the same way. I remember leaving the theater for Lightyear and hearing all the criticisms, and I was like, "That was fine." Yeah. Am I ever gonna watch it again? Probably not.
Exactly.
But like, it didn't move me enough to like stick in my brain. There's a reason that we continue to talk about like characters like Mike and Sully and Buzz, and we know these names off the top of our heads. I can't name you a single character from Lightyear besides Buzz. I think he's called Buzz in that movie. So I don't know anybody else in that movie. I don't even know the cat's name, and that cat was kind of funny. But I'm just like, okay, it didn't stick with me enough to remember anybody or anything in the movie.
Actually, I think I remember the cat's name. I think that's the only thing. I was going in and out of consciousness, of waking up. I think it was Socks.
Yeah, I think it was Socks.
Yeah. Socks.
But here's another thing too, real quick, and I know you got a hard out, Jay, but I real quick want to get this out.
Yeah.
The other thing too is visual, the aesthetics of the film. Like, so if you look at some of the old school Pixar movies, right, and even some of the old school Disney characters, right, like you can recognize Mickey Mouse's colors anywhere. If I was like, that's the Disney bound thing, basically, right? If I wear red shorts and yellow shoes, Mickey Mouse, right? It's like instantaneous. If you have,
if that's the case, OG, we really seriously need to go through your wardrobe.
Right, exactly. I got some problems, right? I got some problems. But even like with Pixar, right? If you have the purple blue with the green, you immediately think of Mike and Sully, right? The iconography, I guess you would call it, of these characters stand out. That's why we don't remember anything in Pixar. I mean, in Lightyear, there was none of that here. It's all very bland. It all blends into the background, and there's none of that, and because, it makes a big difference.
They were relying on the iconography of the Toy Story franchise. They didn't think to create something new and fresh for Lightyear of its own.
Right?
That's so true. That's so true. This has been a fantastic conversation. We're going to continue the 22 storytelling rules from Pixar, and we're going to talk a little bit more about where we think maybe Pixar has changed, if they have changed. Obviously, it has with Lightyear, but that doesn't mean I'm going to pick a much more difficult one for this next one. I'm going to pick like a movie that maybe wasn't as good back in the day and a better one recently, and we'll take a little bit of a different look at it next time we talk. Stay tuned for part 2. In the meantime, definitely go follow all of these people. Evan, where can people find you?
Follow me on Twitter, Harris EV9. Every week we do episodes about Loki because now Loki's dropping episodes. So
Nice.
we're going to do a Loki episode 3 review later this week, and we're doing a movie review of Killers of the Flower Moon because I'm seeing that on Friday as well. So we're going to be talking about Loki, Killers of the Flower Moon, and more stuff like that. Last week we talked about the recent developments under Marvel Television and the chaos that is happening there. Came out last week under the Hollywood Reporter. So again, find me on Twitter, HarrisEV9. The podcast is called My Cup of Tea.
Nice.
And I'll link all his socials down below. So definitely follow, subscribe. Evan's amazing. We love Evan. So support his work down below.
Absolutely. Definitely some process issues going on at Marvel, it sounds like. Yikes.
Oh, yeah.
It's wild.
It's funny. The things we were talking about with Ahsoka and like the issues of television there were the same things, as we said, were happening with Marvel. And it's like everything the audience has been talking about is what's happening behind the scenes. So.
That's so crazy.
Wow.
Crazy. Evan, it's always great to have you on the show. So thanks for joining us. George, where can people find you?
You can find me on X, formerly known as Twitter, at Disney George. You could also find me on the podcast, A Walk with Walt. And, of course, you'll find me here on my home base at Orange Grove 55 with Citrus Corner, with all that sweet, juicy, but sometimes sticky Disney news and info. And I'm glad that we were able to do this. I know this was supposed to be a one-stop show, but I mean, this is just so fascinating, you know, with the topics and the in-depth conversation. So It's like, we're going to pull an Iger. We're going to do 2.
Yeah,
we're going to do 2.
I'll never forget that on the D23 stage. We're not just building one Galaxy's Edge, we're building 2. And the funny thing about that, too, is our buddy on Twitter, Showcase of Wishes, he noticed that day, I guess Iger had 2 mics as well on his shirt. I'm like, that's hilarious.
That's funny.
I'm sure it wasn't on purpose, but still very funny.
They're probably recording him from 2 different sources, but that is really, really funny. Like, you're not just going to hear my voice once, you're going to hear me twice. All right, OG, where can folks find you?
You can find me right here, Orange Grove 55. You can also find me on Instagram, Orange Grove 55, and you can find me on Twitter or X at Orange Grove 55. And Jay, as usual, I want to thank you for being such a gracious host. Amazing time here. Can't wait for part 2.
Oh, it's going to be so fun. We're gonna come back. We're going to talk a little bit more about Pixar and all of their rules and whether or not they are going uphill or downhill or somewhere in between. You can follow me on X at Jay Sherer. You can follow me over there. And in the meantime, follow the Story Geeks right here on Orange Grove 55. We will see you on the next show. Thanks for watching, everybody. Bye.
Bye-bye.